Well, hello, welcome. We are entering into the home stretch of our long study of Ecclesiastes, and we're going to begin the next to last chapter. There's 12 chapters in this great book, and we're going to begin chapter 11, the next to last chapter. Now, we've looked at so many dimensions of this book, and we've been coming off Ecclesiastes 10, which I labeled as a bunch of proverbs and how we could relate to those proverbs in our life. The book has many, many heavy components and undoubtedly has issues just so relevant to our life today as they were back then. Just perpetual things, and that's certainly going to be the truth with today's passage. So, as has been off the case in this chapter, I read through it several times and I have to think about, what direction is this going? How can we frame it? How can we label this? I've labeled today predicting the future. Do you like to make predictions? Well, how accurate are your predictions? How successful are your predictions? I think we are certainly a society that this is certainly every bit a part of our day-to-day life today. So a prediction, or predicting things, is to say that an event or action will happen in the future, especially as a result of knowledge or experience. Now, that's kind of funny about the knowledge or experience. Sometimes that can be helpful, or we think it'll be helpful. Sometimes it will be not so helpful. So let's think about, maybe I'll even ask you right now to think about yourself. What are areas in your life you think you make predictions? I think there's probably quite a few. Right now, we are in what some people call March Madness. It's one of the, I'd say, favorite times of year for fun that people try to make predictions. They fill out brackets. And we have, I think, 64 teams in the NCAA basketball tournament. And they're so-called number one seeds, and this idea of past events give you some ability to predict. Oh, this team won the Big Ten Conference or the SEC, or they have 25 wins and this other team has 15, and strength of schedule, and we think we know, and then like in the first round, there's a team like Colorado State, and they pull an upset. So, but people have fun trying to predict it. But, your odds of successfully predicting the full March Madness bracket are about 1,000,000 to 1. Very, very unlikely to happen. Well, as I'm recording this, there's a lot of warnings throughout the country, including where I live, for all kinds of terrible storms coming up. It's been a season where the weather can be so unpredictable. And we have weather forecasters, and they tell us on a given day there will be a 50% chance of rain or an 80% chance or whatever it may be. And I think we love to say jokes about weather people and their predictions. Well, what about the stock market? It's been one of the most volatile it's ever been. And I said this idea of our definition about using past events. I actually heard something this week about how sometimes our experience actually creates a bias in us. So sometimes our experiences are helpful, sometimes they're not so helpful. And, I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg. This is actually a big business of actuarial science. Think about how insurance works. There's all these abilities, like we're going to pay this premium because we think this is the likelihood of you being in an accident. Well, these are all things we can relate to, but there's even bigger things in life about what we've been talking about in Ecclesiastes, about the future, and not just The stock market can be important to our retirement and managing our assets. The weather could affect us day to day with a big event, or it could affect certain people and their crops and their finances. We care about our teams, but then there's the ultimate issue of what happens to us in life. And so we can sort of laugh at it, but there's definitely some serious parts. So this is all kind of set up to some things we're going to be talking about in this chapter and as we get in the home stretch. So with all that said, let's get into the beginning of our verses. I hope this will give us a starting point to wrap our minds around it. So beginning with verse 1 of Ecclesiastes 11, cast your bread upon the waters, and you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. Now, and I'm just going to stop here for a second. I don't know about you, I've started to frame this already. I start reading this chapter, I read it once, twice, 3 times. I'm trying to think, what is this saying? Cast your bread upon the waters. Have you ever heard that saying? It was a new one for me. So I pondered it. I looked at the whole chapter. I read some commentaries. I thought about it. So I think there's multiple good meanings behind all this. What is casting your bread? It's the idea of casting. It's the idea, we're given a provision, but we do things with it. The idea of the waters, one of the areas that was a big investment at the time was investing in ships and waters. And so you had to have a trust and a faith that you're going to make that investment. And it might take a long time for it to pay off. We think about even later on, as there was explorations in the founding of our country, there had to be money invested to come into the lands that we have here. The waters can also mean a multitude. Cast your bread upon the waters towards other people. Now, there's also this thing about give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what disaster may happen. I think there's 2 parts. I mentioned the idea of taking your bread and investing it. If we wanted to use that investment principle as well, it's about diversification. That take a portion of what you have and don't just put it in one place. Put it in a lot of places, this idea of 7 or even 8. Because it says you don't know what disaster may happen. If you put all your eggs in one basket, using a proverb, then if there's calamity, if there's disaster on that one basket, you've lost everything. If you put all your money in one stock and that stock fails, how would you have liked to in the day put all your money into Enron when it failed? So there's the principle of diversification. But I think there's the other idea too. I also talked about waters being a multitude, this idea of giving a portion. It's also about casting your bread to others and giving a portion of what you have to 7 or to 8, to be generous, to give to other people. And we think about even at our last year in the United States, we've seen some terrible disasters. We still see the aftermath of the eastern United States and what happened in the Carolinas. There was people given a portion to help those in those circumstances. So I think there's wisdom in both our investments here and the wisdom in terms of giving to others. And we have to trust that whether we're talking about our investments, whether we're talking about our giving, that those things will have good payoffs. We'll find it after many days. Well, if we're talking about predictions, it's also our responses to unpredictability. So again, I'm not going to pretend these passages are easy. I've spent a lot of time I've been spending more time than ever each week thinking about these verses. So let's think about this. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth, and if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Okay. So if we observe, oh, it's raining. It's pretty easy to be a weather person. Look, it rained. It's different than predicting it, but we don't know if it's going to rain. Or, I used example several weeks back about a tree falling on the person who's now our governor of Texas, and about it was such a circumstance where that tree fell. It's one thing when you see a tree that falls, say, well, there's a tree that fell. It's another thing to predict how a tree will fall. But this is where it gets very interesting. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. Have you ever felt, because something was hard to know the outcome, that you were almost in a state of paralysis? Oh, it's trivial. Well, let's say, should we do this event today? It looks like, I'll use an example of myself. I like to golf. Oh, there's a 50% chance of rain today. It may rain, it may not. Should we go or should we not? Okay. So you don't go. So for me, if I don't go, it's nice and sunny. If I do go, I might get rained upon. But you could get so focused on it that you're left in a state of paralysis. But it could be about investing. Well, what's the market going to do? I don't know. So it leads to inaction. It leads to, again, paralysis. The anxiety chokes you. So you don't do anything. Because you don't know, oh, that tree might fall on the house. Oh, it might rain today. Oh, this bad event may occur. So you start thinking about that, and it chokes out any action. And then one more thought here, and I want to kind of start thinking about the big principles here. And then we get into all these why questions. And we can say, well, it's stressful to not be able to predict things. It's stressful not to be able to control things. We can even think of tragedies in life. I saw a person this week, and they were talking about how they lost their faith, and they had seen a child who had developed a very rare disease. He said, how could this happen? This poor child has this disease. Why? And it could lead to kind of a crisis of faith, of dealing with the inability to predict the uncertainty. And people can question God over it. But he goes on and says here in verse 5, as you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. We have lots of questions. Back at the time of Solomon, back at the time of ancient philosophers, why questions? We can think about them as hypothetical to others, or then a reality can strike us. We say, why? Why this disease? Why cancer? Why did this earthquake occur? Why did this terrible storm occur? God, how could you allow such things? And it's a little scary. And there's a lot of the book of Ecclesiastes, which is kind of scary because it's wrestling with these deep issues. But this is actually the beginning of the drawing of the conclusion of the book. I said we're in chapter 11. It's going to go on to chapter 12. And the book has been very honest with Solomon, with his own wrestlings. But it says here, let's start with verse 5. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones and the womb of a woman with child. That's a very interesting thought. One of the things that certainly has not changed since the beginning of the world is that God created men and women and given them special relationships, and He's given us the ability to know each other in a special way, to have children. It's part of the circle of life. He says the spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child. And people say, like this person who was losing their faith and said, how, God, did you allow this child to have this terrible circumstance? But actually we see that God even comes in our womb. The Bible says that we are knit together in the womb of our mother from the beginning. And he comes into our bones. And think about even the miracle of creation. Think of the miracle of our life. Think about the miracle of the earth itself, which sits in just the right place. And where the moon is positioned, and our atmosphere, and this precious earth, the precious life that we've been given. So we can look at circumstances and we can see what we think is wrong with our eyes and our limited understanding. Or we can choose to see that which is good and to acknowledge that there is a work of God who makes everything, and I can't understand it. And Solomon was so intelligent, and he purposed to study these things. And he said he could not know it. He wanted to know it. And it's natural to want to know it, but there's unpredictability. I can't even predict a basketball game. I certainly can't predict the weather. I can't predict the stock market. I could try to study. I could use so-called big data. I could develop models, but there are things that are just uncertain, and there are things we just can't know, and we have to acknowledge that it's God who makes everything. These are some big issues of life. And I wanted to note something, as I'm going to draw this to conclusion today. There was a sermon given back in July 3rd of 1890. Just think about how long ago that was. Of course, think about how old the book of Ecclesiastes is, written thousands of years ago. But Spurgeon did this wonderful, beautiful sermon back in 1890 called Sowing in the Wind and Reaping Under Clouds on this chapter. And, it's a very long sermon, but I really enjoyed reading it. It's a sermon out there if you want to Google it. If you found the thoughts in this chapter interesting, I encourage you to do that. But one of the things that he references in that is the example of a farmer in light of these verses. Now think about something. Farming back in the 1800s was a very big profession, which a very high percentage of people are still farmers. We still have farmers today. But if you're a farmer, what can you predict? So a farmer's starting the season. If they start to question everything, they may not even begin to plant the seed at all, because there's things they can't predict. Or they could say, I don't even understand the pattern of the rain. What can understand? They might have some experience. Let's say it's an older farmer. They've been farming for many years. They might say, well, normally this is what happens in March. We get our last freeze, and this is what happens in April, and this is when we get the rains. And when it rains, this is usually what happens. But you can enter into a state of paralysis, thinking, well, it might rain so hard all my seed will wash away. Oh, this may happen, that may. I don't even know if I can do it. Or you might just say, well, I'm not going to even lay my seed at all. I'm not going to even farm. I'm just going to observe others. I'll make detailed notes. This idea of just being an observer and not a participant, not involving action. And there's just questions. How I don't understand how the seed's going to produce its crops. And we could just question things to death. We could say, well, old Bob's farm last year, it all got destroyed. So that if that could happen to him, it could happen to me. Now, there's a place for some questions, but there's a place where the questions distract us to such an extent that we're into paralysis. We get worried about our inability to predict. I've already mentioned before that I like to control things, I like to predict things, but I can't. So as we begin to enter the home stretch, as we begin to wrestle with these things, and here we're just talking about a farmer, let's think about extending this to any other part of life, including our relationship with God and our salvation. Oh God, why did you allow that person to get that disease? God, why did that hurricane occur? God, I don't understand why there's this on the earth. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't know. And we have these questions. But there's a point in time we have to have faith to say, God, I'm going to acknowledge you. I cannot predict things. I can't understand everything. I can't control everything. But I acknowledge that you can. And I'm not going to let this be a state of paralysis where I'm just an observer. I need to participate. My faith needs to be active. I don't understand everything. It's like the Spirit coming into the wombs of a child. Do I understand that? No. Do I even understand the miracle of birth? I do not. There are many things I don't understand. But as I begin to get my mind right, and I believe this is where Solomon is heading, as we say, God, I don't understand everything. I certainly cannot predict things. I can't control things. But I acknowledge that there is a plan and there is a purpose in all these things. I'm not going to be like a farmer who lives in such a state of fear I don't do anything. But I'm going to live my life as an active participant with my faith in you. And we're going to continue that thought as we finish the chapter next week.